wind howled through the darkened forest, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and fallen leaves. Thick storm clouds loomed over the town of Silverbrook, painting the night sky in shades of deep gray. The occasional crack of thunder sent shivers through the few travelers who dared to be out. But deep in the woods, beneath the towering pines, a pair of golden eyes gleamed in the darkness. The dog, thin, matted, and trembling, had been wandering for days. His ribs pressed against his skin, his paws cracked from the endless search for shelter. Hunger gnawed at him, but something stronger kept him moving. A quiet hope. Miles away, Daniel Harper, a volunteer at Silverbrook's Animal Rescue Center, was wrapping up his shift. He had spent the evening tending to rescued animals, feeding them, checking their conditions, offering what little comfort he could. Just as he was locking up for the night, his phone buzzed. "Daniel, we got a report. Someone saw a stray near the old logging trail. Looks bad. Can you check it out?" Daniel sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. It was late, and the storm was growing worse. But something in his gut told him this wasn't just another stray. On it, grabbing his flashlight and a thick raincoat, he hopped into his truck and headed toward the woods. The rain came down harder as he reached the trail. He parked, stepping into the mud, and switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the dense forest. Then he heard it, a faint, broken whimper. His heart clenched. He moved carefully, following the sound until his light landed on a huddled figure beneath a tree. A dog. His fur was soaked, clinging to his frail body. His ears twitched at the light, but he didn't move. It was as if he had accepted his fate, too weak to run, too exhausted to fight. Daniel crouched down, speaking softly. "Hey there, buddy. I got you." The dog's golden eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. A silent plea. A promise. Daniel slowly extended his hand. The dog flinched, but didn't retreat. "You're safe now," Daniel whispered, lifting the fragile creature into his arms. The dog let out a heavy sigh and rested his head against Daniel's chest, as if he had finally found what he was looking for. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the beginning of something that would change both their lives forever. Daniel drove carefully through the storm, his hands gripping the wheel as rain pounded against the windshield. Every few seconds, he stole a glance at the dog curled up on the passenger seat. The poor thing barely moved, his thin body shivering despite the warmth of the truck's heater. Daniel's mind raced. The rescue center had already taken in too many strays, and they were stretched thin on resources. He should take the dog there for the night, get him checked out, and figure out the next steps in the morning. But something in his chest tightened at the thought of leaving the dog in a kennel. With a sigh, he made a silent decision and turned onto the road leading to his small home on the outskirts of town. By the time they arrived, the storm had eased into a gentle drizzle. Daniel carried the dog inside, setting him carefully on a thick, folded blanket near the fireplace. He grabbed a towel and knelt beside him, gently drying his damp fur. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Daniel murmured. The dog flinched slightly at the touch, but didn't pull away. His ribs stuck out painfully, and Daniel winced at the sight. Whoever had abandoned him had done so cruelly, without food, without care. "You need a name," Daniel said, rubbing the dog's head gently. "Something strong." The dog blinked up at him, his golden eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "How about Cooper?" A small wag of the tail. Daniel smiled. Cooper, it is. After warming up, Cooper slowly ate the bowl of soft food Daniel set down for him, though his movements were hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to eat. When he finally finished, he curled into a tight ball, resting his head on his paws. For the first time in what must have been weeks, he looked safe. Daniel sighed and leaned back against the couch, watching the dog settle in. He hadn't planned on taking in a pet. His life was already busy enough between work and volunteering. But as he watched Cooper's slow, steady breathing, something in him whispered that maybe this was exactly what he needed. The next few days were a test of patience. Cooper was still weak, and Daniel had to coax him into eating full meals. He refused to go near the door, as if terrified of being abandoned again. Loud noises made him flinch, and the sight of strangers sent him cowering behind the couch. It was clear Cooper had suffered more than just physical neglect. One evening, as Daniel sat on the floor beside him, he spoke softly. I don't know what happened to you, buddy, but whatever it was, you don't have to be afraid anymore. You're home now. Cooper lifted his head slightly, staring at Daniel with those same golden eyes that had stopped him in his tracks that night in the woods. A moment passed. Then, with a quiet sigh, Cooper slowly inched forward, resting his head on Daniel's knee. Daniel's throat tightened. It was the first time Cooper had chosen to trust him. And in that moment, Daniel knew this wasn't just a rescue. This was a second chance. For both of them, the morning light spilled through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the living room. Cooper was curled up near the fireplace, his breathing steady, his golden fur finally starting to regain some of its shine. Daniel watched him from the kitchen as he poured himself a cup of coffee. It had been a week since that stormy night, and every day brought small but significant changes. Cooper ate more, flinched less, and had even started to wag his tail when Daniel came home from work. But there was still something in his eyes, a lingering wariness, a fear that hadn't quite faded. Daniel knew patience was key. All right, buddy, he said, walking over with a leash in hand. Time for a walk. Cooper's ears twitched, but his body remained tense as Daniel crouched down, giving him time to sniff the leash. He had no idea what kind of life Cooper had before, but the dog's reluctance to go outside made one thing clear. He had been abandoned before, and he feared it would happen again. Daniel sighed and softened his voice. Come on, just for a little bit. I promise we're not going anywhere far. After a few moments of hesitation, Cooper hesitantly stepped forward. Daniel carefully clipped the leash onto his collar, half expecting him to pull away. But to his surprise, Cooper let it happen. That was progress. Outside, the air was crisp and fresh, the remains of last week's storm still lingering in the scent of wet earth. The town of Silverbrook was quiet in the early morning, and Daniel led Cooper down a peaceful, tree-lined path behind his house. Cooper walked stiffly at first, his ears flicking at every sound. A rustling branch, a distant car, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. But Daniel kept his pace slow, letting Cooper explore at his own speed. Then, as they reached a small clearing, Cooper suddenly froze. Daniel followed his gaze and saw what had startled him. 2 children riding their bikes on the other side of the park. Their laughter rang through the air, innocent and light-hearted. Cooper took a step back, his body low, his tail tucked. Daniel knelt beside him, gently rubbing his neck. It's okay, Coop. No one's going to hurt you. Cooper's breathing was fast, his muscles tense, but after a few long seconds, he didn't run. Instead, he cautiously observed the children, his ears perking slightly at their laughter. Something in Daniel's gut told him Cooper had been around children before. Maybe he had belonged to a family once, one that had left him behind. The thought made his chest tighten. "Come on, let's keep moving," Daniel said softly, tugging the leash just enough to encourage Cooper forward. This time, Cooper didn't resist. It wasn't much, but it was another step forward. That afternoon, as Daniel sat on his porch reading, Cooper lay beside him, finally relaxing under the warmth of the sun. His tail occasionally thumped against the wooden boards, a sign of contentment that hadn't been there before. Then, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made Cooper's ears perk up. Daniel looked up just as a familiar truck pulled into his driveway. It was Sarah, one of the senior volunteers at the rescue center. She stepped out, her auburn hair pulled into a ponytail, her sharp green eyes scanning the porch. "So," she said with a smirk, crossing her arms. "You told me you were just fostering this one, huh?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I was." Sarah arched an eyebrow. "And now?" Daniel glanced down at Cooper, who was watching Sarah warily but wasn't retreating. Now? He didn't know how to answer that. He had planned to bring Cooper to the shelter once he was healthy enough. That had been the logical choice. But now, the idea of letting him go felt impossible. Sarah must have seen it on his face, because she chuckled. "Yeah, that's what I thought." She crouched down a few feet away, extending her hand. "Hey there, buddy." Cooper's nose twitched, but he didn't approach. He just watched her, assessing. "He's still scared of new people," Daniel said. Sarah nodded. "It'll take time, but he trusts you." Daniel exhaled, looking at Cooper again. Yeah, Cooper trusted him, and Daniel wasn't sure he could break that trust now. As Sarah stood and brushed off her jeans, she gave him a knowing smile. "You've already made up your mind, haven't you?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He just reached down, scratching behind Cooper's ears, feeling the dog lean into his touch. Maybe he had. The next few weeks passed in a way Daniel hadn't expected. Cooper transformed, slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. His ribs, once visible beneath his golden fur, filled out with the help of steady meals. His coat, which had been matted and rough, now had a healthy sheen. But most importantly, his fear, the constant tension in his body, the hesitation in his steps, was fading. It wasn't gone entirely. Loud noises still made him flinch. Sudden movements still caused him to stiffen. But now, when Daniel came home from work, he was met with something new. A wagging tail. A simple thing. But to Daniel, it meant everything. One evening, as Daniel sat on the porch with Cooper at his feet, he found himself staring at the dog's peaceful expression, lost in thought. He had never intended to keep Cooper. That had never been the plan. But now, the thought of letting him go? Impossible. "Guess we both got more than we bargained for, huh?" Daniel murmured, scratching behind Cooper's ears. The dog leaned into his touch, his golden eyes filled with quiet understanding. A soft breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a peaceful evening until the distant sound of an approaching car made Cooper's ears perk up. Daniel frowned, glancing toward the road. He wasn't expecting visitors. A moment later, a dark SUV pulled into the driveway. Daniel stood, placing a reassuring hand on Cooper's back as the car door opened. A middle-aged woman stepped out, her eyes immediately locking onto the dog. Cooper stiffened. Daniel felt it, the way the dog's muscles tensed beneath his hand, the way his tail froze mid-wag. The woman took a step forward, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cooper?" Daniel's breath caught. Cooper's reaction was immediate. His ears flattened, his body trembling, not in fear, but in something deeper, recognition. Daniel swallowed hard, his heart pounding, as he looked between the woman and the dog at his side. "Who are you?" he asked. The woman hesitated before meeting his gaze. "My name is Lisa Carter. Cooper, he was my family's dog." Daniel's world tilted. She took another step forward, her eyes filling with emotion. "He went missing almost 2 years ago. We searched everywhere, but we never found him. She broke off, swallowing hard. "I can't believe it's really him." Daniel felt Cooper tremble beneath his touch. He was staring at Lisa, unmoving, unblinking. "Cooper," she whispered again, kneeling down. "It's me. It's Mom." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, in the smallest movement, Cooper's tail twitched. Just once. And then, as if something in him finally broke free, he took a hesitant step forward. Lisa gasped, her hands covering her mouth as Cooper moved closer, his nose twitching, his body still uncertain. But then, he whimpered, and with that single sound, Lisa burst into tears.
Cooper leaned into her, pressing his head against her shoulder as she wrapped her arms around him, sobbing into his fur. Daniel looked away, his throat tight. He had known this moment might come. He had always known there was a chance that Cooper belonged to someone. But now that it was happening, he wasn't sure what to feel. He had rescued Cooper, nursed him back to health, given him a home. But was it really his home? After a few minutes, Lisa wiped her eyes and looked up. I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For saving him. For taking care of him." Daniel forced a small smile. "He's a good dog. He always was." She hesitated, stroking Cooper's fur. "I'd love to take him home, but I don't want to force him. If he's happy here, She didn't finish, because Cooper had turned around, and he was looking at Daniel. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, Cooper walked back to Daniel and pressed his head against his leg. Daniel swallowed hard. He reached down, running his fingers through Cooper's fur. Lisa let out a watery laugh. "Well, I guess that's my answer." She stood, brushing her hands over her jeans. "It seems like he's already found his home." As Lisa wiped away the last of her tears, she let out a small, bittersweet laugh. "You know, they say dogs never forget the ones they love." Daniel looked down at Cooper, who was now sitting beside him, his tail wagging ever so slightly. "Yeah," he murmured, scratching behind the dog's ear. "But sometimes they also choose who they want to love next." Lisa smiled, a deep understanding passing between them. She knelt down one last time, pressing a gentle kiss to Cooper's forehead. "Be happy, buddy," she whispered. As she walked back to her car, she turned to Daniel. "Take care of him." Daniel gave a firm nod. "Always." The SUV pulled out of the driveway, disappearing down the quiet road. The evening air felt lighter now, the weight of the past settling into something peaceful. Daniel exhaled and looked at Cooper. "Well, I guess that settles it. You're officially stuck with me, bud." Cooper let out a soft huff, as if he had known all along. Then, without hesitation, he nudged Daniel's hand with his nose before settling at his feet. The stars began to twinkle above, and as Daniel sat on the porch watching the night unfold, he realized something. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a story of loyalty, of second chances, and most importantly, a story of finding home.